If you ask most JJK fans what the most complicated technique in the series is, they might say something like domain expansions, RCT, or even just a really complicated curse technique. But the real answer are barrier techniques, and the series shows us this constantly. Take Megumi for instance, who has an innate domain, but is unable to construct a freestanding barrier. Megumi must rely on the environment every time he wants to use his domain expansion, plus he can't imbue the barrier with his curse technique, giving him the guaranteed sure hit. Or Gojo, who is stated to be the strongest and smartest sorcerer of the modern era, but has never been shown to use an open barrier. These aren't characters that struggle with much, but barrier techniques seem to be where they hit their ceiling. Why is that? Why are barrier techniques the most technically demanding skill in JJK? Well, I'm an electrical engineer, and what JJK describes in talking about barrier techniques actually describes a real class of math problems. So let me show you what's actually going on here. First thing to understand is the word barrier is actually somewhat of a mistranslation. The real Japanese word used is Kekkai, meaning zone or territory. You can think of it as a field with a defined boundary. The outer wall is just one component, and it's hardly relevant to the actual definition. So stop picturing a force field when you're thinking of barrier techniques and start thinking of something a little bit more abstract. See, a Kekkai is just a defined space. There's an inside, an outside, and a boundary where the rules are applied. The wall, if there even is one, is just one way to apply the boundary. Some barriers don't even have a visible shell at all. Now here's what those rules look like in practice. See, barriers only recognize things with curse energy. They completely ignore all inanimate objects and those with the heavenly restriction, such as Toji or Maki. I know this is confusing, but all humans have curse energy except those with the heavenly restriction. That means a barrier doesn't block everything the same way a wall does. It's running constant evaluation at every single point along its surface, meaning that's not just a wall, that's actually a function. And making that function selective is where things tend to get a little bit expensive. The manga straight up says that blocking certain people while allowing others through is difficult even for the most skilled sorcerers. So think about what Gojo versus Yuta actually illustrates here. Yuta has more raw curse energy than Gojo. That's confirmed. We all know that. But Gojo can do things with his curse energy that Yuta can't replicate, and a big part of that is just efficiency and control. We all know that Gojo's 6 eyes give him near perfect curse energy optimization. Yuta's early training was literally just forcing him to focus his curse energy into a katana because his output was so overwhelming and unfocused. Massive power equals sloppy control, and sloppy control is not great for barriers. With barriers, being sloppy doesn't just make you less efficient, it makes your boundary function unstable and harder to maintain. More energy poured into a bad function doesn't fix it, it actually makes it harder to hold. So it's precision that actually scales the barrier, not power. And this is because barriers have rules, and rules cost something to maintain. See, now engineers actually have to solve this problem constantly. Anytime you want to define a shape in 3D space, i.e. for game engines, physics simulations, or even just CGI, you need a way to ask any point on that space, is this inside or outside of my shape? The tool for that is called a signed distance function, or SDF. The idea is dead simple. It's a function that takes any point in space and returns just one number. That number tells you the distance between your point and the nearest surface. The sign on that number actually just tells you what side you're on. Negative means you're inside, positive means you're outside, and 0 means you're right on the line. That 0 line is actually the boundary. Now, unfortunately, this is the cleanest example I can give. I know it's scary with the root and your 4 variables, but it's actually not that complicated. This equation fully defines the boundary of a sphere in 3 dimensions. Negative inside, positive outside, and 0 right on the line. Now, here's where it starts to get expensive. Say you want a curtain that blocks cursed spirits but allows humans through. Your function can't just take position anymore, it needs more variables. What's at that point and what rule applies to that thing? Where is the point, etc. So instead of one clean equation, you end up with geometry, entity classification, and conditional permeability all running at the same time at every single point on the surface. The more conditions you stack, the more computationally expensive that function gets. In a game engine, that will tank your frame rate. In JJK, rather, it tanks your cursed energy. And so that's why selective barriers cost more energy than just blanket ones. It's because you're not adding a wall, you're adding different branches of the function that are already running everywhere at once. One thing that most people tend to get wrong is a domain expansion is not just a really powerful barrier. A barrier is just one part of a domain expansion, 3 actually. And it's why you can have some sorcerers who are able to use a domain expansion without knowing how to use barriers, or sorcerers who can use barriers but not complete a domain. Layer 1 is the barrier, the Kekkai. Define a boundary, hold the SDF, and enforce conditions. This is the skill that literally any sorcerer can learn. Layer 2 is the innate domain environment. See, every sorcerer has a metaphysical interior space that is tied to their technique and their personality. Domain expansion takes that inner world and projects it outward onto a physical space. That's where the environment comes from. The twisted geometry, the scenery, the atmosphere, all of that is coming from the inner domain, not the barrier, because that's the sorcerer's soul being externalized. The barrier just holds it in place. Layer 3 is imbuing the barrier with your curse technique. This is where the guaranteed hit comes from. Once the technique is embedded into the barrier itself, it stops from being something you aim and becomes a property of space. Everything inside the domain is already inside the technique, therefore it has nowhere to go. And to have a complete domain expansion, you must have all three simultaneously with no gaps. Miss layer 3 and you've got an incomplete domain. The barrier is there, the environment is there, but no guaranteed hit. That's Megumi's entire problem. And there's actually a specific wiki detail that I think is underrated. You can force close a barrier by overlaying it with a physical structure, like literally using a building as your outer shell. But if you do that, the domain won't have a guaranteed hit. Because layer 3 requires the barrier to have your cursed energy. You can't imbue a technique into a wall that isn't yours. Okay, now let's talk about why this is actually difficult, because I think a lot of people will default to, oh, it's really complicated and takes a lot of cursed energy. But I don't think that really explains it very well. See, I think a lot of the issue is in the geometry. See, the first problem is that the boundary has to be watertight, meaning no gaps and no holes. Because a barrier with a gap doesn't mean a weaker barrier, it means it's not a barrier at all. The moment there's a space in which the inside and outside aren't clearly defined, the entire function collapses and fails. You gotta think of it like a water balloon with a hole in it. It's not just a worse water balloon, that's not a water balloon anymore. The second problem is that it has to stay watertight while moving, meaning every time you move, the SDF is recalculating. The moment someone hits the edge, the surface deforms, it has to recalculate. You're in a fight. The geometry of the space is changing constantly, and the function has to keep up with all of it in real time. This is why constructing a barrier and maintaining a barrier under combat pressure are treated as two completely different skills in the series. You can build the perfect barrier in training and still lose it mid-fight. The third problem is more specific to domains, and the wiki actually calls this out explicitly. See, domain barriers have set parameters, volume, construction speed, and it ordinarily takes time for a sorcerer to discover the precise blend of conditions to get their domain stable. Once they find that stable configuration, they don't change it. Think of it like tuning a guitar. You can get the strings to the right pitch, but it takes time to find, and once you get it, you don't keep changing the pegs every time you go to play. The only time you'd adjust them is if something external forces a change, and doing that mid-cast is how barriers collapse before they're fully formed. Now, there is an exception to the rule. I am talking about Higuruma. He didn't have to search for a stable configuration because it kind of came pre-built with his technique when he figured it out. So instead of spending time from scratch, he could just analyze everything that he already had and work backwards from there. And I think that's how he reverse engineered barrier techniques without formally studying them. All right, now that we got all that out of the way, let me quickly dive into every technique that has been shown throughout the series. Starting with curtains, which are the most common barrier technique. These have a dome shape, hide everything on the inside, and a sky that turns to night. But here's what people miss. You can see the curtain from the outside, meaning it's not invisible. The outside world just can't see in. Another interesting note too is that curtains can actually be commissioned. Kenjaku built the Culling Game's curtains using talismans as well as other tools. See, Kenjaku engineered the Shibuya curtains and loaded them onto talismans so that people who had no barrier technique skill could still activate them just by reciting the incantation. The talisman holds a condition set, so you're basically executing someone else's code. Then we have the simple domain. This has no environment and no technique, and it's just a tight barrier around the user. The whole point is to introduce a competing boundary condition inside someone else's domain and break the guaranteed hit. You're not overpowering the domain, rather you're making the space ambiguous enough that it can't resolve it cleanly. Then we have domain amplification, an empty barrier with no technique inside, completely neutral, and that neutrality is the point. It absorbs the incoming technique effects on contact rather than resisting them. See, this is how Sukuna and the Disaster Cursors were able to touch Gojo. His infinity is a boundary condition and the domain amplification is a competing one pressed right against it. Therefore, they cancel. This last one's kind of weird, but it was shown once. In JJK 0, Gojo draws a circle on the ground to remotely teleport Toge and Panda. This is his limitless. He compresses space between 2 points, but to do that for people he's not physically touching, he needs a fixed point of origin that they're standing on. So I'm guessing the circle is used to set that coordinate. Now here's where it starts to get bigger, because everything we've talked about so far has just been done by one sorcerer. But the barrier system in JJK has an entire infrastructure layer that most people don't even register. Which takes me to empty barriers. Empty barriers are empty inside, hexagonal shaped, and totally reshapeable. We saw Kenjaku shape one into an entire movie theater, and Tengen builds entire networks of them. All it is just allocating space. These are bounded and isolated, but blank. You write whatever you want into it. Then we have pure barriers. So this is where it stops being a technique and starts becoming more of a national infrastructure. See, Tengen has kept a network of pure barriers running across Japan for over thousands of years. They passively suppress cursed spirits, they improve barrier techniques for Jujutsu High staff, and they're the foundation of everything more powerful that gets built on top of it. 4 critical ones: Imperial Palace, Tomb of the Star, Yamakuni Mausoleum in Kyoto, and the biggest one splitting Japan east to west at the Holy Mountain of Hida. Then we have bond barriers, which are the strongest tier of barrier techniques. The Culling Games itself runs on bond barriers stacked directly on top of Tengen's pure barriers as the foundation. and Tengen could have released those peer barriers to stop it, but that meant scrapping 1,000 years of accumulated work, and you don't want to tear out the foundation to fix a problem on the top floor. So that's it. That's why barrier techniques are so complicated. The ceiling was never just about power or energy, it was about precision. And precision doesn't scale with output because barriers have rules.